Hi, I'm Stephen Steer. I work at Zühlke Engineering. Today, I'd like to talk to you about two topics, which is data monopolies and from that, economic architecture. So two very technocratic terms, which I will try and explain in what I hope is an approachable way. So if we get started, I'll just give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So yes, I work at Zühlke Engineering, but recently, over the last few years, I've been working at Ofgem at the energy regulator and spending a lot of my time helping set the agenda for data and digital topics for the sector. I won't dwell too much on this, but I'll just draw your attention to the middle column here on the slide. Recently, we put in place a lot of regulations in relation to how the license obligations on energy network companies and their requirements for how they work with data and digital services. And we'll come back to that at the end of this talk. So if we start with today, I'm going to give a walkthrough to give the business case, the rationale around data monopolies, and just try and do this through what I hope is not too much glib fun, but a kind of state of the market statement bingo. Just a few hopefully non-controversial topics that describe, typically focus on the upstream parts of the energy market, and just try and put this all into context to help you know why data monopolies are relevant and important and what we can do with them. So if we start going through that, let's pick a first one, nice and easy opener. Our physical energy system needs to change. Well, this is something I think everybody's pretty comfortable with these days. We're all well aware of the climate change emergency and the fact that there is a generally growing demand on the energy system. So the system we have today is not going to be sufficient to meet those needs. We need to change it. So let's take that a step further. The consequences of changing the system and decarbonising it is that we need a lot of different technology to that which we've had in the past. So what I mean here is things like mass use of electric vehicles, of battery storage, of solar power, wind generators. There are many different technologies that we did not use in the past that we're increasingly using now. And what comes with that in the modern world is that there is an awful lot of data, both about those assets themselves, but about the energy system around them that they would wish to take advantage of. And in particular, you could think of things like flexibility markets, where generators which have very uncontrollable load factors will want to make sure that they're optimizing their scheduling of when they're generating and importing and exporting power in and out of the grid, and the same kind of case with batteries, for example. So data is part of that solution of how we update and change the physical energy system to get the most out of those new types of assets. So let's take that a step further still. The data's nice, but it needs a vehicle itself to transport it and exchange it between organizations. And the way that data gets exchanged is through digital services. So if I'm a generator owner and I need to know what's happening elsewhere in the energy system, I need someone's digital service to gain access to their data. So we need a digital energy system. I think that's not to be understated. The size and complexity of that digital energy system, I fully expect to be of the same level of complexity as when we built the physical energy system in the first place nearly 100 years ago. That is a large infrastructure undertaking in a very virtual sense. So this is a business case building up for why data is playing a much more important role in the sector, but all big investments come with their challenges and risks, and let's start getting stuck into those. So what are some of the problems with working with data and digital? Well, you'll typically hear comments about people having difficult gaining access to data. And in particular, this is a problem with data because it is generally much more powerful when you join data sets together from different sources. The problem is that in today's energy system, that we have a very federated ownership model. You could go back to the 1980s when we had privatization take place. And okay, public-private ownership is not my point today, but what is important is that we went from a centralized model of ownership of the energy sector to a federated one, where you now need to go to many different actors to gain access to that data. But again, that's not necessarily a problem. Many markets operate where individuals acting in that market need to get their data from many locations, and it's managed just fine. So why is it a challenge for the energy sector? Well, we get onto that last point of this slide, which is that we have what I describe as laterally adjacent data monopolies. So that's a a really abstract term. So what I really mean by that is that we have just a singular energy system that serves our nation. We have chosen to federate its ownership and have individual organizations responsible for different parts of it. So we have now only a single entity that you can go to get the data that you need. And what's more is you need to go to a whole series of different single entities who each have unique sources of data at their disposal. And there is an awful lot of it, and the amount of data is growing. And so all of these entities sit either horizontally or vertically adjacent to one another in the energy supply chain, and anyone acting in it needs to work through a lot of people who all have their own practices and processes for working with the data. So these laterally adjacent data monopolies, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a challenge that we have to overcome because of the nature of the market. So let's take this thought process a bit further still and not just talk about the energy sector, but look at infrastructure data monopolies more generally. And I won't dwell on these, but I just want to bring that picture into your mind. So if we walk through a few of them, examples of where we see this manifest elsewhere are in flood risk management, which the water sector needs to has data requirements from it, but so too does from land, and then that butts up against things like the impacts flood risks can have on other infrastructure like the energy system. So suddenly you start needing data which is typically unique and monopolistic in nature from many different sectors. You can make some similar points about land usage, whether it's about housing or whether it's onto agricultural purposes. If you want to do planning for the UK's economy, fundamentally, even if you're operating in markets, your starting point for that information are unique sources of monopolistic sources of data. Zühlke has spent a lot of time on electric vehicle charge points. Where should we place them across the country? Well, that means needing land information. It also needs transport information, and we spent a lot of time trying to join that together with electricity information. It's very complicated and hard, especially because for each of those you need to go to single sources for your data, and you don't have that marketplace of options that you might get elsewhere. Just giving one example further, healthcare is increasingly taking advantage of digital remote services for giving people their healthcare and treatments. But for everybody to benefit from that, you need effective broadband and networks, or whether they're cellular or physical. But each of those, to be able to plan it, has a lot of information and data associated with them that needs to be made available and therefore comes from single sources. So these are just a few examples, but there are lots of them across society. It's a general and growing problem about how you make sure these array of data monopolies across the economy are working together effectively. Now, there's one more I'll point to on the screen here, which is around government itself. It can both play a really powerful role at ensuring that the various institutions that have responsibility for data monopolies are running effectively, and that they are delivering the remedy, if you like, to their circumstances, which is that they ensure that their data is interoperable by design through their digital services with one another, so that you can solve the kinds of challenges I was just talking through. There is a difficult irony at play, of course, which is that government itself is typically a single source for many different types of data, whether it's the artifacts of its legislation and policies, whether it's the specific services that it offers to society. All of these themselves tend to be very monopolistic in nature. So government has this very difficult tension in its dual role of both solving the problems and also being the cause of them. So if we move on further and say, well, what can be done about that? Well, some things have been done about it in the energy sector recently, and I'll give a light overview of those and show lessons from them, but also have a forward view as well. So if we look back at the energy sector, I mentioned at the start that we put some regulations in place recently. Typically, when people focus on those regulations, the focus is on things like this data best practice guidance, where it has a series of principles, but the last one is around making the data presumed open, which helps make the energy sector be open-armed and ensure that the licensed operators for energy networks data are ensuring everybody can gain access to that data, and it's part of their responsibilities. And that's good, but there's a point that I think is often overlooked that I'd like to make today, which is actually on the other set of guidance that was put in place, which is around the digitalization strategy principles. And in particular, I'm just going to focus on one of them. You see, this first principle is that these energy networks are now obligated to prioritize providing benefits to the stakeholders who pay for their products and services, as well as benefits to the public interest. They're in the public interest. And that's a really important difference to how they're described, to how these kinds of organizations' responsibilities are normally described. Its typical experiences are that an organization that is responsible for monopoly, say in the energy sector, is told to service energy consumers. And that's nice and important, and they will always be the primary customer, but they're not the only customer. And what these guidance have done here with this principle is it's not saying service energy consumers. In fact, it doesn't mention energy at all. Instead, it's saying service whoever needs your data the most, whoever can make the most from it. And that is a change of the terms of reference of these licensed entities. It's a change of their accountability, and it should drive them to integrate with those around them, whether that's within the energy sector or within the sectors more widely. So if we take that as a worked example a bit further, make it a bit real, it's a bit unkind picking on Ofgem, but I know them well, so it's easy for me to do so. You can go on their website and you can see here their powers and duties. And if you look through their terms of reference as the data monopoly that gives you information about energy regulations, what you'll find is that every bit of their obligation says service energy consumers. It doesn't say put energy regulations to best use for society, because those energy regulations are themselves an asset for society. And that has some real ramifications for driving organisations to operate in a more siloed fashion, to prioritise only a kind of tunnel vision on the services they can offer, rather than maximising benefits to our overall economic society. So if we just take an overview to round off with, what we have in today's world is a series of data monopolies in the economy who are each told to service their direct primary consumer, whichever sector it is that they might work in. But actually, I think what that's doing is driving some real pain points in areas where there aren't market forces to encourage people to integrate their ways of working. And actually, where all these monopolies exist, there's a really powerful opportunity to rephrase their terms of reference and to drive them to not say, how do I best serve my vertical markets consumers, but instead to say, how do I put the assets I'm responsible for to best use for everybody? And through doing that, you're creating accountability to require everybody to work with each other much more effectively for consumers' overall benefit. And given the rise of data monopolies across our society, I think that's a really useful insight to the economic architecture of how we design and govern our society. And I say this just to completely finish off with a view of the new task force, the new energy data task force is the digitalization task force, who are looking at exactly these kinds of problems. I think there'll be a really powerful insights if they can help everyone along with changing the terms of reference of how we architect our society's license obligations on and whether that's government or private areas. Thank you.